There exists a mystery buried beneath the sands of Egypt, hidden for so long that most of the world has simply forgotten it ever existed. Yet for thousands of years, it stood as one of the greatest wonders ever constructed by human hands. Classical writers, those ancient observers who actually visited Egypt and walked its mysterious corridors, left behind accounts so consistent, so detailed, and so extraordinary that they demand our serious attention. They spoke of something that supposedly surpassed even the pyramids in grandeur and scale. They called it the labyrinth. Now, when most people hear that word, their minds probably jump to Greek mythology, to the story of the Minotaur locked in a twisting maze on Crete. But there's a much older labyrinth, an Egyptian one, that predates the Greek version by centuries. The ancient writers understood this. They knew that the Greeks had borrowed their labyrinth concept from Egypt, that what they heard about in their own mythology was actually an echo of something far more ancient and far more vast. This is the story of that structure. This is the account of how we know it existed, how it was nearly lost forever, and how modern technology is finally beginning to reveal what lies beneath the Fayum Depression, in what was once the heart of ancient Egyptian civilization. It's a story that involves some of the greatest minds in archaeology, some remarkable acts of courage and exploration, and more than a little bit of mystery about why certain discoveries have been so deliberately suppressed. So let's begin with the voices that first told us about this place, the eyewitnesses who actually saw it with their own eyes, and the extraordinary claims they left behind for us to puzzle over today. When we talk about the labyrinth, we're really talking about the impressions left by men who were there. These weren't modern archaeologists with theories and speculation clouding their observations. These were travelers, historians, and natural philosophers who stood in the actual chambers and tried to describe what they were witnessing in real time. The earliest and most famous of these voices belongs to Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era, around 484 to 430 BCE. Herodotus travelled extensively throughout Egypt, and he spent considerable time studying its monuments and mysteries. When he encountered the labyrinth, he was deeply impressed, so much so that he wrote about it with an almost overwhelming sense of awe. Listen to what he actually said about it, because his words matter. He wrote, "This I saw myself, and I found it greater than words can say. For if one should put together and reckon up all of the buildings and all of the great works produced by the Hellenists, they would prove to be inferior in labour and expense to this labyrinth. Though it is true that both the temple at Ephesus and that at Samos are works worthy of note." Think about what Herodotus was claiming here. He was saying that if you took every single structure built by Greek civilization, all their temples, all their civic structures, all their architectural achievements that Greeks were so justifiably proud of, and added them all together, the total amount of labour and expense required to build them would be less than what went into building this one structure. That's an astonishing statement coming from a Greek historian speaking about something Egypti. And he wasn't being hyperbolic either. He was trying to express something he genuinely couldn't find adequate words for. But he went further. He compared the labyrinth not just to Greek achievements, but to the pyramids themselves. He said, "The pyramids were also greater than words can say, and each one of them is equal to many works of the Hellenes, great as they may be, but the labyrinth surpasses even the pyramids. If you've ever stood in front of the Great Pyramid at Giza, if you felt that overwhelming sense of scale and ancient achievement, then you understand why this statement is so remarkable. Herodotus is saying that the labyrinth exceeded even that. He provided detailed descriptions of its structure. The labyrinth, he explained, had 12 courts with gates facing one another, 6 on the north side and 6 on the south side, all joined to one another within one continuous outer wall. He described 2 kinds of chambers within it, underground chambers and chambers above ground, and he noted that there were 3,000 of them in total, with 1,500 of each kind. The scale alone should make your head spin. 1,500 rooms on one level, 1,500 on another. He wasn't finished with his description either. He wrote that the roof was made of stone, the same stone as the walls, and that the walls were covered with carved figures. Each court was surrounded with pillars of white stone fitted together with such precision that the joints were barely visible. At the end of the labyrinth, by what he called a corner, there was a pyramid rising to 40 fathoms, which is roughly 75 feet in height, and this pyramid had large figures carved upon it. Most crucially, there was a way made underground connecting the pyramid to the labyrinth itself. Herodotus admitted something interesting, though. He said he had only seen the upper chambers with his own eyes. The lower chambers, the ones underground, he had only heard about through hearsay. But what he said about them was consistent with what he'd seen above. The passageways were confusing, winding through courts and chambers in ways designed to confuse anyone trying to navigate them. He noted that you really did need a guide to find your way through. This wasn't just a building to him. This was something extraordinary, something that represented a level of planning and execution that seemed to exceed what human beings were normally capable of. Herodotus wasn't alone in his observations. Several centuries after him, another ancient writer named Strabo visited Egypt. Strabo was an ancient Greek geographer who lived from around 64 BCE to 19 CE, essentially around the time of Jesus. He wrote extensively about Egypt and its wonders, and he too visited the labyrinth. Strabo offered some additional details. He described it as a building quite equal to the pyramids, which is interesting because he's being slightly more measured than Herodotus, though equal to the pyramids is hardly a small claim. He reinforced the description of multiple palaces, or courtyards, lying contiguous to one another, each surrounded by columns. But Strabo added something about how the whole complex was connected. He said there were hidden chambers before the entrances, chambers that were long and numerous, with paths running through one another that twisted and turned. He emphasized the labyrinthian nature more than other writers. No one could enter or leave without a guide, he said, which sounds almost like a warning. What's particularly interesting about Strabo is that he also compared the labyrinth to another structure, Sichur. He mentioned something called the Menonian in a city called Abydos, describing it as a palace wonderfully constructed of massive stonework, and noting that the labyrinth was built in the same way as we have said the Menonian was built. This is significant because it suggests that the construction techniques used for the labyrinth were similar to other mysterious megalithic structures in Egypt. Strabo described the roofs of the chambers as being made of single stones, and he mentioned that the hidden chambers were spanned by monolithic beams of outstanding size, with no wood or other material included. The entire building occupied an area of more than a stade, a Greek measurement roughly equivalent to about 600 feet. At the end of this vast structure stood the tomb, a pyramid on an oblong base. Then there was Pliny the Elder, a Roman author and naturalist who lived from 23 to 79 CE. Pliny actually wrote a natural history that was remarkably comprehensive for its time, and in it he discussed the labyrinth. He was quite explicit about the fact that it actually existed, that it wasn't a product of imagination or myth. He wrote, "Let us speak also of labyrinths, quite the most extraordinary works on which men have spent their money, but not as may be thought of the imagination. There still exists even now in Egypt the one which was built first, according to tradition, 3,600 years ago." Now here's where things get interesting. If Pliny is speaking in the 1st century CE, and he's talking about a labyrinth that was supposedly built 3,600 years before his time, that puts the construction of the labyrinth at around 3,600 BCE. The Egyptian civilization as we know it isn't even supposed to have begun until around 3000 BCE. So either Pliny is exaggerating the age, or there's something very old at Hawara that predates what we think of as dynastic Egypt. Pliny made additional claims about its comparison to the Cretan labyrinth. He said the Cretan labyrinth was supposedly built by the craftsman Daedalus, using the Egyptian labyrinth as a model, and that the Cretan version imitated only 100th part of the Egyptian one. That's quite a claim about the size difference. He also provided information about what the labyrinth was made from. He said the entrance and columns were made of what he called Paran marble, which we would understand as white calcite or alabaster. The rest of it was made of Aswan granite. He emphasized that these massive stones were put together in such a way that time itself could not dissolve them, even with people actively trying to destroy it by quarrying. He also mentioned that men were already weary with traveling when they reached the bewildering maze of paths. There were lofty upper rooms, reached by ramps and porticos, and from those chambers, one descended on stairways which had 90 steps each. Imagine that. 90 steps just to descend from one level to another. That suggests these weren't small, intimate chambers, but massive halls with tremendous vertical distance between levels. Inside, he claimed there were columns of imperial porphyry, images of gods, statues of kings, and representations of monsters. The decorative program, if Pliny is accurate, was elaborate and intentional. Other sources had described a structure that seemed to have housed not just empty chambers, but active religious or civic functions. Diodorus Siculus, another ancient Greek historian from Sicily who lived in the 1st century BCE, visited Egypt and saw the labyrinth himself. He described entering a sacred enclosure where he found a temple surrounded by columns, 40 to each side. This building had a roof made of a single stone, carved with panels and richly adorned with paintings. He emphasized the perfection of the craftsmanship, saying that in respect of carving and other works of craftsmanship, the builders left no room for their successors to surpass them. The work was simply perfect. He also noted that it was impossible to find one's way out again without difficulty, unless one encountered a guide who was perfectly acquainted with the labyrinth. The labyrinth was not something you could just wander through and expect to find your way back. It was genuinely designed to confuse. Pomponius Mela, yet another Roman geographer who lived from the 1st century BCE to around 45 CE, added more details. He wrote that the labyrinth included within the circuit of one unbroken wall, 1,000 houses and 12 palaces. It was built of marble and roofed with the same material. It had one descending way into it and contained within it almost paths. Notice that phrase, almost paths, which had many convolutions, twisting hither and thither. The paths caused great perplexity because of their continual winding and because of porticos that often reversed their direction. People would continually run through one circle after another, continually turning and retracing their steps forward and backward, so that the labyrinth was fraught with confusion by reason of its perpetual meandering. What's remarkable is that across all these different writers from different time periods and different cultural backgrounds, we see the same basic descriptions emerging. The numbers might vary slightly, the emphasis might differ, but the core picture remains consistent: a massive structure, multiple levels, chambers and courtyards arranged in a confusing pattern, made of white stone and granite, requiring a guide to navigate. What all of these ancient writers had in common was consistency. They weren't contradicting one another. They were all describing the same basic structure. Enormous, confusing, filled with chambers and courtyards, built from white stone and granite, connected underground, with a pyramid attached to it, and requiring a guide to navigate. None of them were talking about a small temple or a modest administrative building. They were describing something absolutely massive, something that required immense resources and planning to construct. And they all seemed to understand that this was something ancient, something that had been around for a very long time, even when they saw it. The Renaissance period in Europe saw a renewed interest in the classical world, and this included a renewed interest in what ancient writers had said about Egypt. Artists and scholars of that era created illustrations based on the historical accounts, trying to imagine what the labyrinth might have looked like. These weren't scientific reconstructions, but they show that educated Europeans took the ancient accounts seriously. Some depictions showed 12 massive courts arranged around a central structure. Others showed the more traditional labyrinthian maze of confusing passages. One particularly striking copper plate engraving showed what appeared to be massive columned halls beneath the ground, with a small Roman-era town built on top of them, completely unaware of what lay beneath. The artistic imagination had seized on the descriptions and tried to reconstruct something from the words. But illustrations and renewed interest weren't the same as actual exploration. That began in earnest in the 17th and 18th centuries, when more adventurous travelers began journeying to Egypt specifically to look for the sites described by the ancients. Paul Lucas visited in the late 17th century and wrote about what he found. Dr. Richard Pocock came in the 18th century and made similar observations. Luigi Canina arrived in the early 19th century. All of these men traveled to Hawara, the location identified by historians and geographers based on the ancient descriptions. And all of them left accounts of what they found. The Fayum Depression itself, where Hawara is located, was the site of Lake Morris in ancient times, a substantial body of water that had gradually been managed and redirected through canals as Egyptian civilization developed the land. The depression contained remnants of ancient structures, fragments of stone, and evidence of long-standing human activity. But probably the most famous visitor was Napoleon Bonaparte himself. Napoleon was fascinated by Egypt. He spent a night in the Great Pyramid, studying its mysteries, and his expedition included scientists and artists documenting everything they could find. They visited Hawara, and from their descriptions and drawings came some of our best images of what was visible at the site in the early 19th century. A remarkable book called The Description de l'Égypte compiled Napoleon's findings and was published in parts throughout the 19th century. It's still available on archive.org today if you want to see what Egypt looked like to French eyes in the early 1800s. The renderings show the pyramid at Hawara with the surrounding desert landscape, and they attempt to capture the scale of what was visible. Carl Richard Lepsius came later in the 19th century and created detailed maps of Hawara, specifically labeling the structures he believed to be remnants of the labyrinth, and showing the pyramid as well. His maps were compared with later satellite imagery, and they align quite well with what we know about the site's geography today. Lepsius's work was informed by all the earlier accounts and his own observations. He was systematically trying to document what was actually there, versus what might have been lost or destroyed over time. He understood that he was looking at a palimpsest, multiple layers of history written over one another. By the time the 19th century was well underway, it was clear to historians and archaeologists that something substantial had existed at Hawara. The question became, what exactly was it, and what was left of it? The ancient accounts were too consistent, too detailed, and too numerous to dismiss. Every credible ancient writer who had visited had described something extraordinary. The stories aligned too well to be mere fantasy. But they also raised a crucial problem. If this was so vague and so remarkable, why didn't more of it remain visible? Why, when you went to Hawara in the 19th century, did you mostly see sandy fields and fragments? The answer seemed to be that the site had been extensively quarried. For centuries, people had apparently extracted stone from Hawara to use in other building projects. Pliny himself had mentioned this, noting that the Heracleopolitans had extracted stone from the site with extraordinary hatred. Yet the masses of material were so great that they couldn't deplete them. In the Roman and Persian periods, a substantial town had apparently been built directly on top of the earlier structures, and this town had served as a base for the quarrying operation. Archaeological evidence would later confirm that there were indeed massive mud brick structures from the Ptolemaic period scattered across the site, and within these structures could be found fragments of much older stone, repurposed and reused. So while the ancient writers described the labyrinth's surface features and the chambers they could see, by the time modern archaeologists arrived, centuries of activity, he had obscured and destroyed much of what had been visible. The question that began to form in the minds of serious scholars was whether anything of significance remained underground, beneath all the accumulated debris and later construction. That's where the story takes a remarkable turn, because someone was about to go and find out, and what he would discover would change everything we thought we knew about Hawara. Sir Flinders Petrie was one of the greatest archaeologists of his era, and arguably one of the most important archaeologists Egypt has ever known. When Petrie came to Hawara in 1888, and again in 1910 to 1911, he was systematically applying modern archaeological methods to the investigation of what the ancient writers had described. He knew the historical accounts intimately. He understood what Herodotus and the others had claimed. He was specifically looking for the labyrinth. Initially, Petrie's attention focused on the mud brick pyramid that stood at Hawara, which he identified as belonging to Amenemhat, the third of the 12th dynasty, based on inscriptions he found. But beneath this pyramid, he quickly discovered something far more interesting: a massive megalithic structure made from enormous blocks of stone. The entrance to this subterranean complex was unusual. Unlike most Egyptian pyramids, where the entrance typically appears on the north side, this entrance was on the southwestern corner of the pyramid, below the ground level. The entrance itself was constructed from enormous blocks of stone, and it was clear that the pyramid had been built over and around this earlier structure, not the other way around. Petrie realized he was looking at something genuinely mysterious. When he began to explore beneath the pyramid, he encountered a situation that would test him severely. He had to tunnel through the mud brick of the pyramid itself to reach what was below. His own account of this exploration is worth reading carefully because it gives us a sense of what he faced. The sand between the mud bricks was in very thick layers, sometimes half an inch to an inch, and being dry and clean, it would run out continuously in an hourglass effect from the joints. He had to board up the roof of the tunnel constantly to prevent the bricks overhead from loosening and collapsing. The bricks themselves were enormous, double the size of English bricks, and weighing between 40 and 50 pounds each. A single brick dropped on a person would, as Petrie dryly noted, settle his moving powers for some time to come. He was essentially tunneling through tons of ancient mud brick in stifling heat, doing the work himself because he felt the local workers wouldn't take sufficient care. Eventually, he struck massive sloping roof blocks of granite and quartzite, each 4 or 5 feet thick. These were clearly the top of the structure beneath the pyramid. When he tried to cut through them, his workers threw up their hands in despair. It wasn't until the following season, when he returned with more determined stonemasons, that they managed to hammer their way through these massive stone beams. Once inside, Petrie began exploring what he had uncovered. The passages were filled with debris, water, and mud. He had to dig his way through much of it, crawling through narrow spaces that had been sealed for thousands of years. In his own words, he described the exploration as genuinely terrifying. He got stuck at one point, so tightly wedged in a passage that he knocked out his candle, leaving him in absolute darkness until matches could be brought from outside. He described sliding through passages filled with mud on his fingers and toes, propelling himself forward using only his hands and feet in complete darkness, save for the light from torches that his workers were holding. He waded through water in the antechamber that was so saline and caustic that it burned his face. The ground was full of sharp crystals of sulfate of lime that cut like knives. He had to scrape a path clear through these crystals to even be able to move forward without shredding his skin. Yet he persisted, measuring and documenting everything with meticulous care, eventually finding what appeared to be the entrance passage leading into this vast underground structure. The water level was already high enough that he couldn't fully explore everything beneath it, but he was able to map out the structure he could reach. What Petrie found was a series of enormous stone boxes made from granite and quartzite. The largest and most remarkable of these was what's called the subterranean chamber, constructed from a single piece of yellow quartzite. weighing in the realm of 110 tons, possibly more. Around this central box were other massive chambers and corridors, with stone blocks ranging from 20 to 50 tons up to 80 tons or more. The roofing stones were massive slabs, 4 or 5 feet thick, and the entire structure was assembled with precision that suggested careful engineering and planning. The construction was utterly unlike anything Petrie had seen before. The precision of the work, the sheer mass of the individual stones, the complexity of the chamber arrangement, all of it suggested something extremely ancient and extremely sophisticated. This wasn't crude construction. This wasn't experimental work. This was the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing. What was it? Petrie initially believed he was looking at structures connected to the pyramid itself, perhaps serving as chambers related to the pyramid's burial function. But the more he explored, the more he began to wonder if this wasn't actually the labyrinth itself, or at least part of it. He noted that the structure beneath the pyramid seemed designed not merely for burial, but for something far more extensive and complex. When he expanded his excavation to the areas around and south of the pyramid, he found something remarkable. Just beneath the surface, there was a massive layer of stone chips and debris extending over a vast area. Below this layer was a smooth bed of stone or plaster, as if there had once been a complete stone pavement serving as the floor of some enormous complex. The scale of these remains was extraordinary. Fragments of limestone, pieces of granite, and bits of other stone construction materials were scattered across fields for hundreds of meters in every direction. When Petrie tried to calculate the extent of the underlying structures, he realized that the area covered was absolutely enormous. He estimated that the area covered roughly 1,000 feet long by 800 feet broad. That's about 300 meters or more. In his later book about his excavations, Hawara, Biamu, and Arsinoe, he attempted to convey the scale by comparison. He wrote that on that space could be erected the Great Hall of Karnak and all its successive temples adjoining it, the Great Court and pylons, also the Temple of Mut, that of Khons, and that of Amenhotep III at Karnak. Additionally, the 2 great temples of Luxor, and still there would be room for the whole of the Ramesseum. In short, all of the temples on the east side of Thebes, and one of the largest on the west bank, might be placed together in that one area at Hawara. He was trying to help people understand the absolute vastness of what had been there. He noted that the ancient writers couldn't have been exaggerating when they claimed that the labyrinth surpassed all other monuments. The sheer area alone proved they had been describing something genuinely colossal. Petrie found evidence of quarrying activity throughout the area. For centuries, he realized, people had been extracting stone from this site. There had apparently been a substantial Roman or Ptolemaic period town built on top of the ruins, complete with mud brick houses and administrative structures, and this town had served as a base for industrial-scale quarrying. The people living there had been systematically extracting the stones of the ancient structure for use elsewhere. This explained why so little remained visible on the surface. Stone from Hawara had probably been used for countless building projects throughout Egypt, but Petrie's crucial realization was this: the layer of stone he found beneath the later structures, the smooth plaster bed beneath that, wasn't the complete destruction of the labyrinth. It was the remains of its destruction. Yes, but destruction of what? He believed he was standing on the foundation of this vast structure. But as modern scanning technology would later reveal, Petrie was probably standing on what remained of the roof or the upper levels. The structure was still there, beneath him, intact at deeper levels, waiting to be discovered by technology that wouldn't exist for more than a century after his explorations ended. What Petrie found beneath that pyramid changed everything he thought he understood about the architecture of ancient Egypt. The structure he encountered was something entirely different from what the ancient writers had described in their accounts of chambers above ground. What lay below was something far more systematized, far more deliberate, and far more massive in its construction. The chambers he discovered were not simply hollowed-out rooms. They were precision-cut boxes, some fashioned from enormous single pieces of stone, engineered with tolerances that modern construction would struggle to match. The engineering alone demanded respect. The architectural philosophy represented in those stones suggested minds deeply trained in mathematics, in structural principles, in the properties of different types of stone, and how they behave under load. This wasn't crude work. This wasn't trial and error construction. This was the work of engineers who knew exactly what they were doing, who had planned every detail in advance. The yellow quartzite superchamber alone, that 110-ton box sitting in the heart of the structure, raised questions that archaeology had never adequately addressed. How did anyone, whether ancient Egyptian or some earlier civilization, work with stone at that scale and precision? How were these massive blocks positioned and fitted without modern machinery? The larger blocks he encountered, the 80 to 100-ton roof beams, suggested not random construction, but purposeful design. Everything about the structure's engineering pointed toward a civilization that understood load-bearing principles, architectural geometry, and stoneworking. Techniques at a level of sophistication that frankly seemed impossible for the time period attributed to dynastic Egypt. What Petrie was looking at, if we take the classical accounts seriously and combine them with what modern scanning has since revealed, was a complex, multi-level structure with chambers designed at massive scale. The historical writers had mentioned halls that could hold 40 columns on each side. If those descriptions were even remotely accurate, we're talking about interior spaces with ceiling heights measured in tens of meters. The ancient accounts spoke of courtyards, open spaces, not tight corridors. Think about what that means architecturally. You need enormous spans to cover such spaces. You need structural systems capable of supporting massive roof loads. You need precision engineering to prevent catastrophic failure. The vault systems used at places like the Osirian, the Serapeum, even certain chambers in the Great Pyramid demonstrate that whoever built these structures understood the principles of load distribution, of counterpressure, of how to engineer spaces that could remain stable across centuries. The labyrinth, based on what we can piece together, appears to have employed similar or even more sophisticated architectural principles. The actual architectural program seems to have involved creating this layered underground complex with interconnected passages and chambers organized in a way that was genuinely confusing to navigate. Pliny mentioned that men became weary traveling through the bewildering maze of paths. He said people needed guides. That's not accidental design. That's intentional. Someone planned those passages to work that way. The question is why? Was it defensive? Protective? Did it serve some ritual function that required complex spatial progression? Or was it something else entirely? Perhaps a storage facility? A repository for something that needed to be carefully preserved and protected from both physical decay and unauthorized access? The classical authors emphasized the religious components. They spoke of temples within the structure, of statues of gods and kings, of images carved into walls. Diodorus mentioned entering a sacred enclosure with a temple surrounded by those 40 columns on each side. If that's accurate, then the labyrinth wasn't just a building. It was a sacred space, a place where ritual activity took place. The precision of the joinery, the quality of the stone, the engineering sophistication, all of it points toward a structure built for permanence, built to endure. When you look at other megalithic sites in Egypt, places like the Valley Temple or the Osirian at Abydos, you see the same commitment to precision, the same use of massive stone blocks, the same engineering principles. Strabo actually made that comparison himself, noting that the building techniques at the labyrinth resembled those at the Menonian in Abydos. He wasn't making that observation casually. He had visited both sites. He was noting what he saw. The construction philosophy was consistent, whether it was white calcite columns or massive granite roof beams, whether it was quartzite boxes or limestone blocks, the approach was the same. Perfect fitting, no wasted material, no rough work. Everything finished to precise specifications. The scale of the thing is what really staggers the imagination. Petrie calculated that the area covered by the remains at Hawara was approximately 1,000 feet long by 800 feet broad. That's roughly 300 meters by 240 meters. He noted that you could fit all the temples of Egypt within that space: Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, everything, in a single area. All of those monumental temples that represent some of the greatest architectural achievements of human history could fit within one building. That's the scale we're talking about. A structure that massive, with multiple levels separated by depths of 20 to 50 meters, with chambers 80 to 100 meters in length, represents an organizational and construction effort of absolutely staggering proportions. When you think about the Fayum Depression, where Hawara sits, you need to understand that you're looking at a place that was fundamentally shaped by water. The Fayum is this leaf-shaped depression off to the left of the main Nile Valley as you move south. Today it's an agricultural zone. But in ancient times, particularly in the period that classical authors were writing about, it was dominated by Lake Moeris. That lake was a major hydrological feature. The ancient Egyptians carefully managed it through channels and locks. They understood that the lake provided resources: fish, papyrus, water for irrigation. The lake levels fluctuated seasonally with the Nile flooding, and the Egyptians built infrastructure to control and utilize that cycle. In the narrow section called the Neck of the Fayum, where the depression connects to the main valley, stood Hawara. And at Hawara stood the pyramid of Amenemhat III, with the labyrinth apparently stretching out beneath it. The location itself is significant. You don't build something on that scale in that location by accident. The Neck of the Fayum would have been a critical transportation and administrative point. It's where goods moving between the Fayum and the main valley would have passed through. It's where the management of the lake's waters would have been centered. If the labyrinth was a storage facility, this location made sense, central to a major agricultural region, defensible, controlling the flow of goods and resources. If it was a ritual center, the location near the lake, near water, would have held significance. Water was life in Egypt. It was the source of creation according to Egyptian mythology. Building a sacred structure near this major water source would have made perfect religious sense. The Barabi Canal that cuts through the site today was built in the 1830s, but it follows what appears to be the path of ancient canal systems. When excavators clear this canal, they regularly pull up stone fragments, granite blocks, pieces of limestone and calcite that aren't natural to the area. For centuries, for literally centuries, people have been extracting stone from the labyrinth site and using it for other projects. It was a quarry, yes, but a quarry that had enormous amounts of material to extract. Pliny himself noted that even with all the extraction happening, the masses of material remained enormous. The destruction of the labyrinth wasn't some swift obliteration. It was a long, slow process of systematically dismantling the structure and reusing the stone. That stone went into other buildings, into walls, into whatever construction projects needed material. Over time, the visible structure disappeared. But as Petrie realized, and as modern scanning has confirmed, it didn't disappear completely. It went underground, buried beneath the remains of later occupation, preserved in the geological layers. When you look at the evidence from the various scanning technologies, what emerges is a picture of a structure that was deliberately multi-leveled. The ground-penetrating radar revealed what appeared to be different horizontal layers. The satellite-based technologies like those used by Geoscan and Merlin Burrows detected distinct levels separated by specific depths. The Matahar expedition's geomagnetism surveys showed walls with consistent thickness and spacing arranged in what they described as a grid structure. All of these different techniques, using completely different methods of detection, were picking up the same basic architectural signature: multiple distinct levels with organized chamber arrangements. That's not random structure. That's designed architecture. That's a building program conceived as a multi-story complex from the beginning. The ritual and religious dimensions of the labyrinth become clearer when you consider what the ancient writers emphasized repeatedly. They didn't just describe chambers and passages. They emphasized temples, sacred spaces, religious decoration. Diodorus talked about the perfection of the craftsmanship, noting that the builders left no room for successors to surpass them. He wasn't just commenting on technical skill. He was noting that the quality of the work conveyed something spiritual, that the craftsmanship itself was a form of religious expression. In Egyptian religious thought, precision in construction was understood as a form of participatory magic. Creating something perfectly, in exact geometric proportions, with exact measurements, was understood as aligning human work with divine principles. The act of construction itself was ritual. The 12 courts that Herodotus described take on additional significance when you consider the sacred number 12 in Egyptian religion. 12 represented completeness, divine order, the 12 hours of the day, the 12 houses of the zodiac, the 12 principles that governed cosmic order. If the labyrinth actually had 12 major court spaces, that would be making a theological statement through architecture. The building itself would be a physical representation of cosmic principles. Each courtyard could have served as a ritual space for specific religious functions, each associated with particular deities or principles of order. The overall structure would have functioned as a kind of architectural mandala, a representation in stone of the fundamental principles governing reality. The presence of a pyramid attached to or integrated with the labyrinth adds another layer to this interpretation. Pyramids themselves were understood as cosmic mountains, as representations of the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos in Egyptian creation mythology. They were tombs, yes, but they were also theological statements. The pyramid at Hawara was mud brick, not stone, but it was cased in white limestone in antiquity, probably inscribed with religious texts or images. It was positioned at the end of the labyrinth, as if it were the culmination point, the destination toward which all the passages led. That would make the entire complex a processional route, a journey through multiple transformative spaces, ultimately reaching the sacred mountain, the place of rebirth and transcendence. The presence of water in the labyrinth in ancient times is noteworthy. We know from modern conditions that the site sits above a rising water table. But even in Petri's time, when he was excavating, there was water filling chambers at considerable depth. That water is likely related to the nearby Lake Moeris. There may have been deliberate water channels, deliberately incorporated into the labyrinth's design. Water channels running through underground chambers, creating an acoustic environment, creating ritual pathways, creating a sensory experience designed to guide people through specific spiritual transformations. Underground chambers with water create particular acoustic properties. Sound travels differently. The experience of moving through such spaces, hearing water echoing, moving in semi-darkness illuminated by torchlight, would have been profoundly affecting. That's not accidental. If the labyrinth served religious purposes, incorporating water into the design would have been deliberate. The descriptions of decoration are also significant. The walls were covered with carvings. There were statues of gods and kings. There were images of monsters, according to Pliny. Those carvings weren't just decorative. In Egyptian religious and artistic tradition, images had power. Creating an image of something was understood as bringing it into being spiritually. The act of carving, of creating, of depicting was itself ritual action. An underground chamber covered in carved images would have functioned as a spiritual space where multiple layers of reality intersected. The physical chamber, the spiritual presence of the depicted gods and creatures, the eternal realm that the images were understood to access, The fact that people needed guides to navigate the labyrinth wasn't just about preventing people from getting lost. It was about controlling access, about ensuring that only those who had been properly prepared, properly initiated, could reach the inner sanctums. Mystery religions in the ancient world typically involved secret spaces, hidden chambers, restricted access. Initiates progressed through stages of revelation, each level revealing deeper sacred knowledge. The labyrinth's confusing passages would have served exactly that function. The surface chambers might have been relatively accessible. The inner chambers, the deeper levels, would have been restricted. The guide would have been a priest or religious specialist who controlled access, who had memorized the passages, who understood the significance of each space. The descriptions of stairways with 90 steps descending to the next level take on new significance when you think about this. 90 steps isn't just a distance, it's a ritual journey. Ancient Egyptian religion was deeply concerned with transformation through progressive stages. The journey to the afterlife involved passing through multiple gates, each guarded by spiritual beings, each requiring the traveler to speak the proper incantations and demonstrate the proper knowledge. The descent through 90 steps would have been understood as a spiritual descent, a movement away from the ordinary world of light and daily life and toward the deeper spiritual realities. By the time someone reached the bottom of those stairs, they would have been transformed in their mental and spiritual state, prepared for whatever ritual experience awaited them in the deeper chambers. The connection to the pyramid at Hawara becomes even more significant when you understand that pyramids in Egyptian religious thought weren't primarily tombs. They were resurrection machines, places where transformation occurred. The king entered the pyramid, descended through passages, encountered divine forces, and emerged transformed, reborn into eternal life. If the labyrinth was connected to this pyramid, if there was indeed an underground passage leading from the maze to the pyramid as some accounts suggest, then the entire complex would have functioned as a unified ritual space. The labyrinth would have been the place of initiation, the place of progressive revelation. The pyramid would have been the culmination, the place of final transformation. You would enter the labyrinth. You would pass through its confusing passages. You would pass through its temple spaces. You would ascend or descend through its multiple levels. And ultimately, you would reach the pyramid, the sacred mountain, the place of rebirth. What's remarkable about this is that it fits a pattern we see repeated across Egyptian religion and architecture. The temple at Luxor functions this way. It's laid out as a processional route, a spiritual journey. The person traveling through it moves progressively deeper into the sacred, from the outer pylons into the inner sanctuaries. Every element of the architecture guides the spiritual progression. The proportions, the decorations, the orientation toward the sun or toward specific celestial events. Everything contributes to the overall experience and meaning. If the labyrinth functioned similarly, then the entire complex would have been designed as a spiritual journey, a guided movement through sacred space designed to transform consciousness. The geological history of the Fayum also informs how we should understand the labyrinth. The Fayum Depression is essentially a drainage basin. In ancient times, it received water from the Nile through a channel system. Lake Moeris would accumulate during the Nile's flood season and be drained during the dry season through similar channels. The water table in the region, the groundwater beneath the surface, is therefore tied to these hydrological cycles. But there's something else. The depression contains deposits of various types of stone, limestone in particular, and in some areas, deposits of more ancient rocks. The whole region is geologically complex, formed by processes that predate human civilization. The presence of such a massive structure at this exact location, at the narrowest point where the Fayum connects to the main valley, at the place where water management and flow control would have been critical, it can't be coincidental. One possibility that historians and archaeologists have considered is that the labyrinth was originally built even earlier, and the pyramid of Amenemhat III was built on top of or adjacent to it to make some kind of historical or religious claim. Maybe the pyramid was meant to associate the Middle Kingdom pharaoh with whatever sacred functions or powers the labyrinth possessed. Or maybe it was the other way around. Maybe the original labyrinth was built in a much earlier period, and the mud brick pyramid was added later as a marker or monument. What we know for certain is that the pyramid itself, while made of mud brick, was cased in white limestone, probably decorated with religious texts and images, and was clearly meant to be visible and impressive when it stood intact. It wasn't hidden, it was a statement. Someone wanted people to know that this location was special, that this place was significant. The role of water in the Fayum context deserves additional consideration. The entire Fayum economy revolved around water management. The Egyptians were extraordinarily sophisticated in their understanding of hydraulics, irrigation, water control. They built nilometers to measure water levels. They built canals and locks and basins to store and redirect water. They understood how to use water strategically to support agriculture and commerce. If the labyrinth was built in this context, it would almost certainly have incorporated water deliberately. Underground chambers designed to interact with water, chambers where groundwater would flow in specific patterns, chambers designed to create water-based spiritual experiences, all of this would have been technically possible and religiously meaningful. There's also the question of what the massive stone boxes beneath the pyramid were actually for. The super chamber, that 110-ton quartzite box. The smaller boxes around it, what did they contain? What was significant enough to warrant engineering solutions that remain obscure to modern engineers? Petrie couldn't examine them fully because of water. The modern scans can detect them but can't see inside. Were they sarcophagi, storage chambers, ritual vessels? Were they meant to contain sacred objects, religious texts, offerings to deities? In Egyptian religious context, certain objects were understood as inherently powerful, charged with spiritual energy. The act of containing such an object in precisely engineered stone would have been understood as a way of concentrating and containing that power, making it available for ritual use. When you consider the labyrinth in its full context, the architectural sophistication, the massive scale, the multiple levels, the confusing passages deliberately designed to control movement, the connection to the pyramid, the location at a cosmically significant site with important water management functions, the religious decoration and temple spaces, a picture emerges of a structure that was far more than simply a storage facility or an administrative building. This was a massive religious complex, a place designed to facilitate religious experience and transformation. It was a building that encoded within its architecture the fundamental principles of Egyptian cosmology and spirituality. It was a physical manifestation of sacred principles created with extraordinary skill and dedication by people who understood that the quality of their work, the precision of their engineering, the beauty of their craftsmanship was itself a form of worship and spiritual expression. The fact that modern technology is only now revealing what classical authors described 2,000 years ago speaks to something profound about the nature of knowledge and discovery. The ancients knew this place existed. They described it. They passed down accounts of it. But the mechanism of that knowledge, how exactly people at ground level could understand and describe a structure that is now known to extend multiple levels deep into the bedrock, that raises questions that haven't been adequately addressed. How did ancient visitors know about the deeper levels? How extensive was exploration? How much of the labyrinth was actually accessible in antiquity versus how much was known through indirect means? These are questions that can only be answered through actual exploration, through systematic excavation, through accessing those deeper chambers that remain sealed and flooded and mysterious today. The suppression of information about the labyrinth in recent years is frustrating precisely because the site represents such an extraordinary research opportunity. If the Fayum region was indeed the center of a sophisticated religious and possibly administrative complex, If the labyrinth was integrated into a larger system of water management, resource distribution, and spiritual practice that characterized the civilization that built it, then understanding that civilization would require understanding the labyrinth. Every other significant archaeological discovery requires investigation and resources and scholarly attention. The labyrinth deserves nothing less, yet it remains essentially inaccessible, its secrets protected as much by political considerations as by rising groundwater and cycle barriers. The potential of the site speaks to larger questions about Egyptian civilization that archaeologists and historians continue to debate. How did the Egyptians achieve what they achieved? Where did their knowledge come from? How did they organize labor on such a scale? How did they develop these architectural and engineering capabilities? The labyrinth, if properly excavated and studied, could potentially provide answers that challenge conventional understandings of Egyptian history. It could reveal whether the sophisticated megalithic structures we attribute to the dynastic period actually represent a continuation of even more ancient construction traditions. It could demonstrate levels of continuity in architectural practice and knowledge that span thousands of years. When you look at the descriptions provided by the ancient writers, Herodotus, Strabo, Diodorus, Pliny, and you overlay them on what modern scanning technology has revealed, the picture becomes consistent. Multiple sources, separated by centuries, describing similar architectural features. Multiple modern techniques, using completely different physical principles, detecting similar structures at similar depths. The convergence of evidence is significant. It suggests that we're not dealing with fantasy or exaggeration, but with genuine architectural remains that have survived through the millennia beneath the sands of the Fayum. The scale remains the thing that truly staggers comprehension. A structure covering over 100,000 square meters, with multiple levels extending 100 meters or more into the bedrock, with chambers 80 to 100 meters in length, with walls several meters thick throughout, with massive stone elements precisely fitted and positioned. This represents one of the most ambitious construction projects any civilization has ever undertaken. The labor requirements alone would have been extraordinary. The time investment would have been measured in decades, if not longer. The economic resources required would have been equivalent to or exceeding the resources required for pyramid construction. What's particularly interesting is that the labyrinth doesn't appear to have been a project that could have been completed in a single generation. The complexity suggests that it was built in phases, that different sections were added over time, that the overall plan evolved as it was being constructed. That kind of long-term commitment to a single project, that kind of sustained focus on a religious or administrative complex, suggests a civilization with stable governance, consistent leadership vision, and the ability to maintain focus on multi-generational projects despite changes in political leadership. These are not characteristics typically associated with casual or primitive societies. These are characteristics of sophisticated, well-organized civilizations with deep cultural commitments and stable institutional structures. The connection between the labyrinth and the pyramid at Hawara suggests that by the time Amenemhat III built his mud brick pyramid there in the Middle Kingdom, the earlier structure was already ancient. He didn't build on the site randomly. He chose this location specifically, probably because it was already sacred, already significant, already connected to older religious traditions and practices. The pyramid, in that context, becomes less a primary monument and more an addition to an already existing sacred landscape. It's a way for a Middle Kingdom pharaoh to associate himself with earlier religious authority, to position himself within a continuum of sacred practice that extended back beyond his lifetime. This brings us back to the fundamental mystery of the labyrinth. Who built it? When? With what resources? And perhaps most importantly, why has its significance been so consistently underestimated or suppressed in modern times? The classical writers had no doubt about its importance. They placed it among the wonders of the ancient world, comparable to the pyramids themselves. Yet in contemporary archaeology and Egyptology, It receives almost no serious attention. Textbooks barely mention it. Expedition budgets don't include it. It's treated almost as if it doesn't exist, despite overwhelming evidence that it does. That disconnect between what ancient sources tell us and what modern scholarship acknowledges is itself a mystery worth investigating. Why would a structure described in such consistent detail by multiple ancient sources be so thoroughly dismissed or ignored? The answers, as we've seen from the suppression of the Matahar expedition results and the jailing of researchers who tried to investigate further, often involve bureaucratic control, political considerations, and practical difficulties. But those reasons shouldn't be allowed to stand in the way of genuine archaeological investigation. The labyrinth remains beneath the Fayum, waiting. Its chambers are there, potentially preserved and protected by being underground, away from the destructive forces of wind and erosion that have claimed so many above-ground structures. The deeper levels, according to the scan data, may even be free of the water that plagues the shallower sections. There's a genuine archaeological opportunity here, one that hasn't existed for these sites in decades. The technology exists now to map the structure precisely, to understand its full extent, to guide excavation efficiently. All that's missing is the will to proceed and the resources to support the work. Understanding the labyrinth isn't just about satisfying curiosity about the past. It's about understanding human achievement, about recognizing what our ancestors were capable of creating, and about learning from their knowledge and their accomplishments. The classical writers left no doubt whatsoever that the labyrinth was understood as something extraordinary, something that eclipsed even the greatest monuments of their own civilizations. When Herodotus stood before the pyramids, and then stood before the labyrinth, and came away saying the labyrinth surpassed the pyramids in grandeur, that wasn't casual observation. That was a man who had seen the most impressive things the ancient world had to offer, and he was telling his readers that what he witnessed at Hawara exceeded those achievements. Think about what that means for a moment. The pyramids of Giza are among the most massive stone structures ever built. The Great Pyramid covers 13 acres. It originally stood over 480 feet tall. It took decades to construct and required organizing the labor and resources of an entire civilization. And Herodotus is saying the labyrinth surpassed this, not just equaled it, surpassed it. That's a staggering claim. Strabo, who visited both sites as well, described the labyrinth as equal to the pyramids. That's still a remarkable claim coming from someone who had actually been to both places. Pliny noted that the Greek labyrinth was only about 1/100th of the size and complexity of the Egyptian one. Diodorus, who wrote extensively about the precision of the craftsmanship, emphasized that the builders had left no room for successors to surpass them. He's not just talking about scale here, he's talking about perfection, about the quality of the work being so refined that there was literally nothing more that could be improved upon. This was about more than size. This was about perfection in execution, the level of precision required to fit those white calcite columns together so perfectly that you couldn't see the joints. The engineering necessary to span massive interior spaces with monolithic stone beams that might weigh 80 or 90 tons, positioned without visible support or mechanical advantage. The organizational capability to maintain such precise standards across an entire complex covering over 100,000 square meters, with multiple levels, with thousands of chambers, with passages designed to confuse and control movement. We talk about the pyramids as the ultimate expression of Egyptian architectural achievement, as the pinnacle of what ancient Egypt could accomplish. But the ancient writers who actually experienced both structures firsthand consistently rank the labyrinth higher. Consistently. That's not something that should be dismissed or explained away. And when you consider that multiple modern scanning technologies have now confirmed vast multi-level chambers at specific depths, with walls several meters thick, organized in grid patterns all below areas where classical writers specifically said the labyrinth stood. That consistency between ancient testimony and modern technology becomes even more significant. The labyrinth wasn't just bigger or more complex than the pyramids. According to the descriptions, it was fundamentally different in character. The pyramids are tombs, monuments to individual rulers, eternal houses for the dead. Their vertical gestures, pointing upward toward the heavens, designed to last forever as repositories for the remains and treasures of pharaohs. The labyrinth was described as something completely different. It was described as a functional complex, a place where people moved through spaces designed to confuse and control their movement, where multiple levels descended into the bedrock, where temple spaces and sacred enclosures combined with administrative or storage functions. It wasn't primarily a tomb. It wasn't primarily a funerary monument. It wasn't primarily about death. It was a monument to human organization, human capability, human knowledge. And that distinction matters tremendously. One is a vertical gesture toward eternity, a tomb pointing upward. The other is a horizontal labyrinth of human complexity and purpose, extending outward and downward, encompassing vast functional spaces. If the labyrinth was indeed what the ancient writers described, it represented a different understanding of monumentality altogether. It wasn't about creating a permanent home for the dead. It was about creating a permanent repository for something or some place for something. Maybe sacred objects, maybe knowledge, maybe crucial resources. That's a fundamentally different architectural philosophy. The comparison between these two structures becomes even more interesting when you consider the time periods. The pyramids, at least the stone ones we see at Giza, are attributed to the Old Kingdom, roughly 2700 to 2200 BC. The labyrinth, based on Petrie's identifications and dynastic affiliations, has its visible pyramid from the Middle Kingdom, around 1800 BC. But both Pliny and Strabo suggest the labyrinth was far older than that. Pliny specifically says, according to tradition, it was built 3,600 years before his time, which would place it around 3,600 BC, 1,000 years before organized dynastic Egyptian civilization supposedly began. Think about what that means. If accurate, that puts the labyrinth before the first dynasties. That puts it back into a period that archaeology considers pre-dynastic, a time when Egypt supposedly hadn't yet unified under centralized rule. And yet here was this massive complex, encompassing hundreds of thousands of square meters, built with techniques that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. If that's accurate, if the labyrinth is actually that old, then it represents continuity of knowledge and building technique across an almost incomprehensible span of time. It means the same architectural philosophy, the same understanding of massive stoneworking, the same precision in joinery and design, persisted essentially unchanged for thousands of years. That's not something you see very often in human history. Civilizations change, technologies evolve, styles transform, techniques improve or degrade or get forgotten. But the megalithic aesthetic that we see in the Valley Temple, the Osirian, the Temple of Menkaure, and apparently in the Labyrinth, maintains a consistency that defies easy explanation. These buildings look like they were designed by people who knew exactly what they were doing, who had refined their techniques over centuries, who understood principles of engineering and proportion and material science at a deep level. And if the labyrinth predates all the other megalithic structures by 1,000 years, then it suggests these techniques were already developed and refined before dynastic Egypt even existed. And yet that's exactly what modern scanning technology is suggesting. Multiple distinct levels, each separated by 20 to 50 meters, all maintaining the same architectural standards, all constructed with the same materials and techniques. The deeper structures, according to the scan data, may even be better preserved, protected from the destructive forces of weathering and time by their position deep in the bedrock. The comparison to the pyramids ultimately isn't really about size or complexity or labor investment, though the labyrinth apparently exceeded the pyramids in all those measures. It's about what the labyrinth represents in terms of sustained human achievement. The pyramids are singular monuments, expressions of concentrated power and resources in specific moments in time. The labyrinth appears to be something different. It appears to be a repository, a storage facility, a ceremonial complex, a place where knowledge or sacred objects or valuable materials were carefully preserved and protected in multiple levels of redundancy. You'd design something like that if you wanted to ensure preservation across millennia. You'd build it with perfect precision and massive stone to resist decay. You'd organize it in multiple levels so that even if some sections failed or were damaged, others would survive. That's the thinking of people who were concerned with long-term preservation, with ensuring that whatever they were protecting would endure. Over the centuries following the classical author's descriptions, the labyrinth experienced a slow, systematic destruction that transformed it from a standing monument into buried rubble. The quarrying that Pliny described wasn't a sudden event. It was ongoing, continuous, systematic extraction of material across generations. People recognized that the labyrinth contained vast quantities of already cut stone, stone that was already shaped and precisely finished, stone that could be extracted and reused for other projects. Why spend resources quarrying and finishing new stone when you could take material that was already prepared? This was efficient, economical, and it led to the gradual dismantling of the structure. And honestly, it makes sense from a practical perspective. People didn't have the concept of cultural preservation that we have now. They didn't think of ancient monuments as something that should be maintained for posterity. A building standing in a useful location, built from useful material, that was an opportunity, not a treasure. The Greek and Roman authors who visited the site saw the labyrinth still largely intact, still recognizable as a unified complex. Herodotus could walk through the vast courtyards. Strabo could admire the engineering. Pliny could note the extraordinary labor that had gone into its construction. By the time Petrie arrived in the late 1800s, more than 2,000 years later, most of the visible structure had been removed. What remained were the scattered fragments and stone chips that covered the site. The layer of building debris that Petrie could see but couldn't convince people was artificial rather than natural formation. People looked at this massive field of rubble and stone chips, this area covering 100,000 square meters or more, and thought it was a natural feature. Petrie had to document it carefully, measure its extent, analyze it, before scholars would accept that this was the remains of human construction. The quarrying activity apparently peaked during the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, which would explain why classical authors described the labyrinth as still intact, while also noting the extensive quarrying that was occurring. There was a whole town built around this industry, accordai, and to Petrie, not just a few workers, a whole community dedicated to extracting stone from the labyrinth and transporting it for use in other projects. Imagine the labor that required. Imagine the organization necessary to extract 80 to 100-ton granite blocks and move them without modern machinery, without vehicles, without cranes. These were being quarried by hand, separated from the structure using wooden wedges and metal tools, and then transported on sleds or rollers or through some other mechanical means that we don't fully understand. And this continued for centuries. One generation of workers extracting stone, passing the knowledge to the next, the town persisting because the work persisted. The Barabi Canal that runs through the site today was built in the 1830s by the Frenchmen who also built the Suez Canal, but it may follow the path of earlier ancient canal systems that also cut through the labyrinth site. When this canal is cleared for maintenance and irrigation, workers regularly pull up stone fragments, granite pieces, limestone blocks, alabaster scraps, remnants of the extraction process. For nearly 2,000 years, this has been happening. The stone keeps coming up from the depths. Every time they clear the canal, more artifacts emerge. This is ongoing geological and historical layering. The surface structures disappeared, excavated and removed. Their stone repurposed for temples and administrative buildings and defensive walls. But the deeper levels, protected by their position underground, protected by the massive depth of stone above them, protected by the geological layers that built up on top, survived. That's the critical thing to understand. The destruction of the labyrinth wasn't complete. It couldn't be complete. You can't excavate through hundreds of meters of bedrock without technology that doesn't exist even now. The quarrying went down to a certain point and then stopped. What lay deeper continued to exist, unknown but preserved. What makes this destruction particularly tragic is that it was preventable. If the site had been recognized as significant and preserved, if the resources that were spent quarrying and extracting had been directed toward protecting the structure instead, the labyrinth might have remained intact. But that's not how antiquity worked. Civilizations rose and fell. New peoples inhabited the land. They didn't have the same reverence for the monuments of their predecessors that later scholars developed. Stone was a resource. A building standing on useful building material was an opportunity, not a cultural treasure. The Aswan Dam, built in the 1960s, created a new problem by raising the water table. This happened because the dam changed the cycle of the Nile. Before the dam, the river would flood annually, depositing water and silt, and then would recede, creating a long dry season where the water table would drop. This seasonal fluctuation had been part of Egypt's natural rhythm for millennia. The dam eliminated that rhythm. Now the water level in the Nile is essentially constant, controlled by the dam operators. That means more water is present in the system year-round. It wicks up into the surrounding soil and rock. The water table begins to rise. Water that had previously remained below the deeper levels of the labyrinth began to encroach. The groundwater that Petrie could wade through in certain chambers is now a permanent feature, saline and caustic, working slowly to dissolve and erode the stonework. The precise fitting that made those joints invisible becomes compromised when they're exposed to persistent water. The granite begins to weep mineral salts that crystallize on the surface, a process you can observe when you look at the entrance to the substructure beneath the pyramid. The limestone begins to dissolve very slowly as the acidic water works on its surface. The alabaster becomes compromised. The entire structure, protected for thousands of years by being underground, protected from weather and erosion and the destructive forces of the surface world, begins to deteriorate once the water levels change. This is the real tragedy. Not that the labyrinth was excavated and dismantled by ancient peoples. That was always a possibility in the ancient world. But that it still exists, substantially preserved in the bedrock, and is now being slowly destroyed by geological and hydrological changes that are recent enough that they could potentially be reversed. The problem is recent. The damage is ongoing, but still relatively limited. If action were taken in the next decade or two, the situation might be reversible. If nothing is done, if the rising water table continues unchecked, the labyrinth's deterioration will accelerate. The suppression of information about the labyrinth compounds this tragedy. When the Matterhorn expedition found it using modern scanning technology, they tried to publish their findings. They wanted to raise awareness, to get resources allocated to the site, to begin serious investigation and preservation efforts. When the Polish university team tried to investigate the water problem systematically, their director was jailed. When researchers attempted to raise awareness and generate support for preservation and excavation, they encountered barriers from bureaucratic control and political calculation. The discovery was made and then systematically hidden from public knowledge. Not through malice necessarily, not through some deliberate conspiracy, but through the logic of political convenience. The labyrinth exists, but dealing with its existence requires resources and political will. It requires making decisions about water management in the region, which affects agriculture, which affects the entire local economy. Announcing a discovery while being unable or unwilling to address the problems associated with it creates criticism and pressure. What do you mean you found the most significant archaeological site of the modern era and you're not going to do anything about it? That's a difficult question to answer politically. Better to suppress the information and hope that the problem doesn't become too visible. That calculus made sense from a certain perspective, but it has meant that one of humanity's most significant archaeological mysteries has remained essentially unknown to the world, despite being definitively discovered. The labyrinth has persisted in human imagination long after it disappeared from physical view. The classical authors preserved its memory in their writings, those detailed descriptions by Herodotus and Strabo, and Pliny and Diodorus. Medieval scholars and Renaissance artists studied those accounts carefully and created their own interpretations and illustrations. The structure became a symbol of human achievement, of complexity and sophistication, of mysteries that had been lost to time and buried beneath the sands. For centuries, the labyrinth represented the idea that the ancient world had possessed knowledge and capability that later generations had forgotten. It was proof, or seemed to be proof, that somewhere in humanity's distant past, there had existed people who could accomplish extraordinary things. In the age of European exploration, when explorers and scholars were discovering the physical achievements of ancient peoples around the world, the labyrinth fit perfectly into the narrative of lost civilizations with forgotten knowledge. Here was testimony from respected ancient sources that something immense had existed, something that exceeded even the pyramids in grandeur, and it had vanished beneath the sands. It became an archetype, a reference point for discussions of vanished sophistication and lost achievement. The labyrinth appears in historical speculation and alternative archaeology as evidence that the ancient world was more advanced, and more mysterious than conventional scholarship acknowledges. It's invoked in discussions of ancient knowledge systems, of possible connections between distant civilizations, of the possibility that human achievement in antiquity has been systematically underestimated or misunderstood. Writers and artists have used the labyrinth as a metaphor and as a literal setting for exploring themes of hidden knowledge, of complexity and confusion, of the idea that beneath surfaces that appear simple or empty, vast systems and structures might exist. There's something psychologically compelling about the labyrinth as a concept. It represents hidden depths. It represents knowledge that requires navigation and guides to access. It represents the idea that appearances deceive, that obvious surfaces conceal vast complexity beneath them. The famous Greek labyrinth of mythology, the one associated with the Minotaur and the hero Theseus, who threaded his way through its passages, derives its conceptual power and structure directly from the Egyptian labyrinth. Ancient Greek writers explicitly made this connection. The Greek structure, as described in mythology, is a human creation housing a monster, a place of danger and transformation, a test of courage and ingenuity. The Egyptian labyrinth, by contrast, appears to have been a human achievement. It's of extraordinary proportions, a place of knowledge and storage and perhaps ritual transformation, but not a place of monsters or tests, a place of order and purpose. The mythological labyrinth draws its emotional resonance from the real one. The feeling of being lost, of needing guidance, of encountering confusion and complexity, these experiences came from actual historical encounters with the labyrinth at Hawara. Classical tourists had walked those passages. Classical priests or guides had led them through the confusing corridors. That experience shaped the mythology. The idea of a labyrinth, a place of confusing passages and hidden depths, of mystery and potential danger, of needing a guide to navigate successfully, comes from the actual historical structure that classical authors described. The Egyptian labyrinth became the template for how later cultures understood and represented complexity itself. It influenced architecture and design philosophy profoundly. The concept of the labyrinth as a tool for controlling and directing human movement, for creating spaces where knowledge and secrets could be protected through spatial complexity and confusion, appears in medieval cathedral designs, in medieval palace layouts, in Italian Renaissance garden designs. Architects and designers consciously incorporated labyrinthine elements into their work, drawing explicit inspiration from the classical descriptions of Hawara. The labyrinth became not just a specific monument from history, but a conceptual model for how to organize complex space, how to protect information through spatial arrangement, how to create progressive experiences of revelation and discovery. In modern culture, the labyrinth continues to function as a powerful and evolving symbol. Literature and film reference it constantly. Modern authors invoke it as a symbol of confusion and searching, of trying to find one's way through incomprehensible systems. The image of the labyrinth appears repeatedly in discussions of consciousness and psychology, of the mind as a complex maze of passages and chambers where memories and thoughts exist in different rooms. Psychologists use the labyrinth as a metaphor for exploring the unconscious, for the therapeutic journey of self-discovery that requires navigating complex internal passages and potentially confusing psychological territory. Philosophers invoke it as a symbol of the complexity of reality and truth itself. The idea that understanding reality requires navigating a complex and confusing maze of appearances and deeper meanings. The actual Egyptian structure, lost beneath the sands and buried by rising water tables, has become perhaps more influential as a symbol and concept than it ever was as a physical structure that people could actually visit. It represents something fundamental and compelling that humans find psychologically resonant. The idea that vast knowledge and sophistication can be hidden, compressed into spaces beneath the surface, protected through deliberate complexity and precision engineering, waiting to be discovered by those with sufficient determination and the right tools. The labyrinth's disappearance from the visible world may have actually enhanced its power as a cultural symbol. The fact that it became almost mythical, a structure known about only through ancient texts, makes it more mysterious, more provocative. When the Matterhorn expedition found it using ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetism, when Merlin Burroughs' satellite technology detected vast chambers at specific depths, when multiple different scanning techniques converged on the same conclusions, the labyrinth transformed from a legendary structure into something verifiable, something real. But the myth had already shaped how people understood it. The association with hidden knowledge, with precision and sophistication, with a complexity that required guides to navigate, had already embedded the labyrinth deep in human consciousness. The discovery through modern technology doesn't diminish that symbolic power. If anything, it validates it. The labyrinth was real, it was vast, it was sophisticated, and it has been successfully hidden, first through ancient quarrying, then through geological change, and now through political suppression and bureaucratic control. The very mechanisms that destroyed and hid the physical structure have themselves become part of the labyrinth's meaning. To find it now requires technology and persistence. To study it requires navigating bureaucratic complexities and political obstacles. The labyrinth has become a labyrinth not just in its physical design, but in the access to knowledge about it. That layering of mystery upon mystery, of hidden upon hidden, makes the labyrinth even more powerful as a cultural symbol. The question that haunts all of this is what comes next. The labyrinth exists. Multiple independent scanning technologies have confirmed it. The data is consistent across different methodologies. The historical testimony aligns with the modern discoveries in remarkable ways. The site is accessible, located at Hawara in the Fayum, a known and visited location. It's not in some remote desert location. It's not impossible to reach. And yet the labyrinth remains essentially unstudied, unearthed only through remote sensing, never directly explored, its deeper levels never accessed. The water that protects it from further deterioration also prevents excavation. The political considerations that led to suppression of the Matterhorn expedition's findings persist. No coordinated effort to preserve, investigate, or understand the labyrinth has been mounted. No international campaign has been launched. No resources have been marshalled. The site sits there beneath the Fayum, kilometers of underground chambers and corridors and vast halls, waiting. The opportunity exists. The technology exists. The knowledge exists. What's missing is will, resources, and political commitment. If that changed, if the decision were made to address the water table issue, to develop a plan for managing the groundwater, to excavate systematically, to study what lies in those deeper chambers that Tim Akers detected with his military-derived scanning technology, the payoff could be extraordinary and transformative. The labyrinth could reveal how ancient peoples understood and managed water systems at scales we barely comprehend today. It could show what ceremonial or storage functions motivated its construction, what purpose it served in the landscape and economy of ancient Egypt. It could potentially preserve artifacts or information from a pre-dynastic or early dynastic period, materials that could rewrite chronologies and challenge current periodizations. It could rewrite our understanding of ancient Egypt and human civilization, demonstrating levels of sophistication and continuity that current models don't accommodate. Or it could contain mysteries that don't fit neatly into conventional archaeological frameworks, things that challenge current understandings of what ancient peoples were capable of achieving. Either way, either scenario, leaving it unstudied is a profound loss. The greatest discovery in modern archaeology, one that exceeded in significance the findings at Giza, remains essentially unknown to the world. That situation shouldn't persist. The labyrinth should be excavated. Its mysteries should be investigated. Whatever it contains, whatever its true age and purpose and history, deserves to be understood. The technology now exists to find it, to map it, to eventually access it. The will to do so is what remains to be found. And that will, that commitment, that political and economic decision may be the greatest mystery of all.